Scott.
Thanks, Tiffany. Thanks for that amazing introduction. I'm like, oh wow, I want to meet me. I sound great.
You sound
When you hear it
amazing.
all like that, it's like that's a very, very generous introduction. Thank you very much.
It's incredible. Like your work and everything that you've accomplished is amazing. And what actually drew you to this career?
So when I was younger, I either wanted to be a psychologist or a journalist. So they were my two professions when I was, say, probably in primary school. They were my two things that I was passionate about. And I think the reason I chose journalism as my first career was that I was really passionate about being creative and writing. And journalism was a great way to express yourself. And I also love with journalism the fact you get to, well, like you do really with the podcast, you get to meet interesting people. You get to understand, you get to learn about people. You sort of walk a bit of a step in their shoes. Journalism can give you to be able to meet people that you would never otherwise meet. And plus, I love the fact that it was creative and, I was able to write. And so writing's one of my great passions. So I loved that. And I've been doing journalism for a long time. And now I've written two books. One was on psychology and I'm now really focusing much more on things like burnout and speaking about burnout and really just helping people have the tools so that they can manage their mental health every day, because we're all faced with stress and things that we need to deal with. And if you've got some ways of embedding good habits and in your life, it actually really helps you manage the stress of whatever you're dealing with, whether that's, being like if you've got a busy family, whether you've got a really stressful job, no matter what you're dealing with, if you can develop a bit of these techniques that I like, which are things that people have talked about for a while. But what I do in my talks is I help understand the science behind why these things make a difference. So I'll talk about, for example, meditation and the value of like doing deep breathing exercises to activate your parasympathetic nervous system. And when you understand what these practices are doing for you, it makes you much more likely to want to actually do them because you realize the benefits. Even if you don't love doing it at the time, you still get the benefits from it. So that's why I'm really trying to put the sort of scientific and the evidence behind everything that I talk about.
That's fantastic. I love that. And yeah, evidence-based evidence behind everything is totally extremely important. You find a lot of people present things or post things that have no facts or strong backing for them. So I really love what you do, and especially your social media is really incredible. You get to see like everything is backed up.
Yeah, well, like some people, you never know who's reading the posts on my Instagram, for example. And so I always try to put the scientific references. So if you, for example, are really interested in that paper, it might be an interesting paper about anxiety or about something in particular, you can then go and look it up yourself and read the whole paper and look at all the nuance and all the context that you can't really fit in an Instagram caption. So that way you're empowering the reader or the person looking at that post to then go, okay, if I'm interested in that, I can then go and look it up and get even more information. And you also know that way, by looking at having the evidence base there, it really means that it just gives a level of credibility, because sometimes when you see things, particularly on social media, that sound very convincing, it sounds like people know what they're talking about, but often they don't. And so if you put the scientific references, then I'm really leveraging the expertise of the people who've written those papers. I'm not the expert myself, but I'm able to use their expertise and sort of decipher it for the general public so that they can then understand it.
That's fantastic. I really appreciate that you do that. I have noticed at the bottom you cite the journal, so that's really great that you do that. And when a lot of people, and as we know, like I've done research and my own background in science, that there are a lot of journal articles and a lot of studies out there that are actually not correct at all and shouldn't have been published.
Exactly. And that's another really important thing, that all research isn't equal, and that there are, I probably, when I started covering science and medicine, I probably wasn't really aware of that. I thought, oh, if it's in a journal, it must be good, it must be true. But then what I realized, and I did a couple of stories in Australia of people who had written fraudulent papers and written, fabricated results and things like that. So there's a lot of science that actually gets retracted because they find out that actually it wasn't correct. And also, even having said that, science is always evolving too. So what was correct sort of, a year or two ago, we're always learning new things. So that's why it's important to stay up to date. But yes, you're exactly right. And with your background as a scientist, you know that 100% that, not all journals are equal, and there are some that are have a much higher level of respect than others. So I always look at the quality of the journal where the papers are published as well. That's something that we really look at, things like sample size, like how many people were in this study. When it comes to social media, I don't really post anything that's to do with, it has to be a studies in humans for social media, because the stuff that I'm posting is generally to do with psychology or mindset. And so you're looking, I think a study in a mouse model is probably not going to have that much relevance for the average person. So I really try to look for that much more higher level of evidence before I'll do a post on a particular topic. And I'm really lucky. I've got someone that I work with on my social media now who's actually got a PhD in communications. So between the two of us, we've got a very strong sort of scientific rigor to whatever we're putting out.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Listeners, you got to check it out. I'll tag it in the description. And the other thing, like what you just pointed out something. There are things that were said a couple of years ago that may be wrong, or something in the mental health field, in the psychology field that you read or came across maybe a few years ago. You were surprised that news research is showing something else or something different or the opposite, or.
I mean, I think something that's come up recently that the listeners might be aware of is the use of antidepressants, and the fact that they used to think that depression was caused by a lack of serotonin in your brain, and that by putting the serotonin back in, that would help you feel less depressed. And that's why a lot of the antidepressants are based on that. They're called SSRIs. They encourage the reuptake of serotonin. But it's been pretty well known for a little while now that's not the case, and they're not really sure why the antidepressants work in the people that they do work very well for a number of people. But it's not that lack of the sort of serotonin hypothesis has really been pretty much discredited. So that's something that's a pretty fundamental shift in our thinking about mental health. And there are a whole lot of other things. I mean, I think the biggest thing that's changed, though, Tiffany, is reducing stigma when it comes to mental health, which is something that I'm really glad to see. It was, and there still is stigma in mental health, particularly on the more serious side of mental health. When you come to conditions like schizophrenia, there's a lot of stigma that still surrounds those conditions. But we're seeing a lot of people, which is fantastic, really comfortable talking about the fact that they have anxiety and that they have depression, and being able to talk about it and reaching out for support is such an important step. Because if someone, particularly someone well known, if they come out and say, I've got anxiety or I've got depression, it really empowers someone else hearing that to say, I feel the same and I need help. And so I think it's great that so many people are willing to open up in that way. I think it helps people feel like they don't have to suffer on their own, that they can get the support that they need. So that's another massive change, the reduction in stigma. And I really hope it continues. And I really hope it continues for the more serious mental illness as well, because those illnesses are very debilitating for the people and their families, but yet there's still a real stigma attached to a lot of those conditions.
Absolutely. I love that in Australia in particular, like, more and more people, a lot of Australians will talk about their mental health online and on social media, unlike like other countries. Like, I like that our culture, we really promote like Are You Okay Day, and a lot of mental health, it's quite in a lot of
It
places,
is.
and
And
we
like through
promote it so
schools,
much.
I know I did a story not that long ago with a teenager, and she came from a cultural background where her family, like, talking about mental health wasn't really something that they were comfortable doing. But her school actually picked up that she was suffering from depression and said to her, we think you're suffering from depression. We'd love you if you would like to come and see a counsellor. And she did, and she got lots of great support, and now she's doing so much better. And so there still is definitely some cultural issues for people. But I guess that's why they say sort of it takes a village. So you need to have all those different points where someone can find support in case the family or your close family unit isn't somewhere where it's available. You can maybe get it from your school or university or workplace. So as long as you get that support, it doesn't matter where you get it. The main thing is that you do get it.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point that you pointed. Is Australia is quite multicultural. So there are a lot of cultures. Like in my background is Egyptian. It's very taboo in Egypt for mental health. It's like you're
Mm.
crazy. There's a lot of push now from my generation to like we're talking
To
about
talk about it.
more people are wanting to share about it. The youth are really wanting to say, "Hey, I've got this, I've got that," even though the parents are not
Mm.
supporting psychologists or they're not.
And,
It's like
and that will
taboo.
drive change. That will definitely drive change. The younger generation in countries like Egypt, like you mentioned, that will drive change because when people like the younger generation become the leaders, they will say, we need to talk about this. We don't want this to be hidden away anymore. We need to get people the help and support. And talking about it is the first important step.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, listeners, our question today that we're going to be diving into is how do you calm the nervous system when confronted? Now, Sophie, a lot of people are like almost crippled when they're confronted.
Yeah, so the nervous system is really interesting. So we have what's called the autonomic nervous system, and this is a system in the body that governs so many of our functions. So it governs your heart rate and breathing and digestion. And the nervous system has a number of different states that you can be in. And so when you're confronted with something, for example, there's a number of different things that nervous system can do. You could go into fight or flight, which is where you sort of get really shocked and run away. So imagine an animal being confronted. So humans, we're animals as well. So we can either, get shocked and literally run from the dangerous situation. The other thing that your nervous system can do, which animals do, is they freeze and they like play dead. And so humans can do the same as well. We can go into a freeze state where you can become quite disassociated, and they become very lethargic. They can become like glassy eyed. And it's a survival mechanism. Your nervous system is shutting everything down because it's thinking this big threat is coming and you don't feel safe. So there's a number of ways that we can react when we're faced with a threat like that. And the interesting thing about the nervous system is that it's always looking out for threats. Like its number one role is to keep you feeling safe. And so even though you're not even aware of it, it's not a conscious thing. You don't think about it, but your nervous system is always scanning your environment and the people that you're with to say, do I feel safe? And a good example could be, just say you were raised by a parent who used to yell at you a lot, like say a father figure that yelled at you all the time. And that might be a trigger, so that when you go into a workplace and all of a sudden you have a male boss who yells all the time, and then all of a sudden you're triggered with that fear of what it was like to be a child facing someone yelling at them all the time. And you'd either have that fight or flight where you think, I need to get out of here, or you might have that freeze response where you think, oh, I can't move and I can't handle this. And so that's because it's releasing a trigger from your past. You might not even put two and two together and think, why am I reacting that way when the boss just is yelling? They're not even yelling at me. I can just hear them yelling at someone else. But that's how the nervous system works. It's so intuitive. It's not something that happens on a conscious level. And understanding how your nervous system works is just so important, because then it helps explain why we react certain ways to certain things like that. Like, why are we reacting that way? It's because of your nervous system is just thinking, I don't feel safe. I don't feel safe with that around me because of what's happened in my past. And it can be particularly difficult for people who've gone through trauma. They can be very easily triggered and either go into that fight or flight quite regularly, or that freeze, and that they're more likely, probably if it's severe trauma, to go into that disassociative state where people feel like their whole body shut down, their whole brains shut down. In fact, I just read an amazing book about an Australian academic who was imprisoned in Iran for 800 days. She was an academic just over there for a conference, and she's just written an amazing book about her experience. And she talks about having to shut down the emotional part of herself to survive that trauma. And so in that in that instance, she was in that dissociative sort of shutdown freeze state, like an animal playing dead because there was a predator. It's exactly the same thing. And so it's just fascinating to see what we will do and how the nervous system will react to try to keep you safe. It'll do whatever it can, whatever it thinks it's going to work and be the most successful. That's what it'll do.
Yeah.
But that's why I find the nervous system so interesting, because it really helps understand why we react to certain things and why we act in certain ways.
So would you consider, so like as you're talking there, like I'm thinking just a few things popped in my mind. So is confrontation considered a trigger? People like, is it a trigger that's associated, or are they two different things?
Well, it can be. It really depends on, some people are very, it probably depends on your upbringing and how you handle confrontation. You know, some people don't like confrontation and they would rather diffuse the situation. And in that case, they probably tend to sort of try to placate the other person. But for someone who, say, had a childhood where there was a lot of confrontation going on all the time, then you'd probably go back to, like, how did you react to that when you were a child? Were you always the peacemaker? You were the one always trying to step in and say, oh, it'll be okay, you know, don't argue, it'll be fine. And so often our reactions can stem back to the way we handled things as children. So that can be an interesting way also to think about, if you're reacting in a certain way to a confrontation, for example, to think, you know, why am I reacting this way? And just think about, is it from something that might have happened to me when I was younger? Or maybe you played the role of the peacemaker if you grew up in like a chaotic household and you were always trying to calm things down. Then you'll probably find as an adult, you probably still play that role, that if someone confronts you, you'll be like, oh no, it's okay. You know, let's calm down, nothing to see here. Or conversely, you might be someone who, you know, when you're confronted, then you react as well, and that causes you to explode. And that might be the way you handled, if you were a child and had, you know, chaos around you, that might have been how you handled confrontation as a kid, that you reacted to it as well, and you sort of met equal force with equal force.
Yeah.
And so it can be interesting to think, you know, why am I being triggered by this? Why am I reacting this way? And just sort of step back and pause and think, rather than just react to it, actually think about what's happening.
Yeah.
And actually then respond to what's going on. And that's something that comes, it's not necessarily easy. And sometimes it's easier said than done, particularly in a highly emotional, you know, if it's something that you're really passionate about or someone that you care about. But I think having that sort of resilient and regulated nervous system, it helps you be able to respond to what's going on rather than just react to it.
Yeah.
And that's what we want to aim for in life, you know, because stress and confrontation and, you know, someone cutting you off in the traffic, or,
It's inevitable.
you know, it's inevitable, getting your coffee order wrong, or whatever it is. Some things are going to go matter. How, when things, like, times people will take it personally and think, oh, they're doing that to annoy me. But no, they're not. They're probably just thinking about themselves. They're actually not thinking about you. And there's an interesting concept in psychology called the spotlight effect.
Mm-hmm.
And the spotlight effect is, you know, we think that everyone is thinking about us. Everyone's thinking, oh, you know, Tiffany's walking around thinking, oh, what does everyone think of me? And Sophie's walking around, what does everyone think of Sophie? But in fact, everyone's walking around in their own heads just thinking about themselves.
Yes.
They're not worried about anyone else. So the spotlight effect is actually quite freeing, because when you realize that people aren't thinking about you, they're just in their own heads worrying about themselves. And so as long as you are okay with yourself, and then let that person be okay with themselves. So there's not this great conspiracy out there of everybody thinking and, you know, worrying about you. Yeah. So I find that concept quite empowering in a lot of ways, to know that as long as you're just comfortable in your own skin, you know, happy with your own sort of, it's almost like just staying in your own lane, comfortable in your own skin, and, you know, developing those skills to manage the sort of day-to-day stuff that happens. That's how you build, it's called the window of tolerance. So basically it means that you're better able to tolerate those stressful events that happen. And so the way to build the window of tolerance is by being able to put yourself into that calmer state of your nervous system. And that's through things like doing deep breathing and doing meditation, but also doing things for your body as well, like what are called somatic practices. So it could be yoga, or it could be shaking, or, I noticed, I don't know if you've got pets, but dogs will often, when they stand up, they'll shake themselves out, and it's about releasing all that nervous tension and all that nervous energy. So they do that just instinctively, and that's another way of sort of getting rid of tension, and so that's a great practice as well.
Yeah.
And it just helps build what's called the window of tolerance to help you manage all this stress that comes, left, right, and center in our busy lives.
Yeah, there's some great points that you mentioned. The other thing that you were talking about before, how people freeze and like their everything kind of shuts down. Like, it's not about just being confronted, like someone telling you that they heard, or they got, this hurt them that you did, like something that you said or did or whatever. But you could be confronted by death. Like I know, like in my own family, like when my grandfather passed away, my grandmother shut down completely. Like her
Yeah,
brain
so that would
shut
have been
down, and she was
yeah.
just like, she just went straight to, like, she just almost like her brain was protecting itself.
Yes, and it would have been just so, I mean, I would imagine they probably were together for a long time. So for her, it would have been so difficult for her to sort of imagine life without him. And so as a sort of protective mechanism and a survival mechanism, she would have just shut down and thought, this is the only way I can cope with this
Yeah.
really sad news, is to sort of just like go into sort of shutdown mode.
The shutdown
And
mode too
often,
sorry. The shutdown mode too wasn't like she's not talking. She's talking. She's like singing. She's dancing.
mm,
She's like that. But she's like, it's almost like her life with him, and that part of her brain, that part shut
just was,
down. It was off. It
yeah,
was like, but then she came to it like one time, and she was like trying to find him, and she was emotional, and she was really distraught. But then her brain again protected itself and shut that part
and shut
down.
it down
Yeah,
again.
yeah,
Yeah, wow. It's so fascinating the way, particularly in a traumatic event like, or some, or to do with grief, just what we will do to try to protect ourselves from dealing with something, as sad as losing like the husband that you've had for so long. And I guess that would be just the way that she was able to get through that, by that. Then she was able to still function, like you were saying, she was still doing other stuff and functioning, but that was the only way that she could actually get through it. And I think that's why, it is a way of dealing with it, but it can be challenging if you stay in that state, particularly someone who's been through trauma for a long time. It can be difficult then to sort of put yourself back up to a state where you start being emotional and reacting in a more normal way. So often it can be something that people will work with, if someone's got like, PTSD, or they'll work with a trauma informed therapist to be able to work through the trauma so that they can get out of that sort of freeze or dissociated state and start sort of functioning well again, so that they can feel happier.
yeah. You're talking about trauma, and I like that you're talking about it with people who have been through trauma. So you consider, like, that word's kind of thrown around all the time. Like,
Mm.
a lot of people like everyone's been through trauma, but that's not the case, right?
Oh, look, I guess there are degrees of trauma, and it's also very personal. So, say, for example, Tiffany, you and I could go through a similar experience, and it could be highly traumatizing for you, but it might be fine for me.
Mm.
So it really depends on, you can't even say necessarily that, this is a traumatic experience and that one isn't, because something that could
It
be
will
quite
affect people differently.
benign or could affect people differently. So, and trauma is all about your response to what's going on, I guess, as
Yeah.
well as the actual thing that you're going through. So it's very personalized, and I think it is thrown around a lot. I think it is thrown around quite a lot, but I think there's no doubt that one of the things I really like that I've seen in mental health is that concept of trauma informed care,
Yeah.
which really means that you see everything through a lens of, has this person gone through trauma? And if they have, is what I'm going to say to them or how I'm going to talk to them going to make it worse? and just making sure that you're seeing everything through that lens of trauma and being considerate. And that can be difficult to do, but it's so important, particularly if someone's seeking help and support. Having that trauma-informed care is something that can make such a difference to a person.
Yeah, yeah. Makes sense. So, what are ways if you're being confronted and like someone's a friend, a family member's like, this hurt me, you did this and this, and you're all of a sudden your nervous system's like, in seconds it's losing its baseline. What can you do in that moment?
Well, there's a few things that you can do. If you're in that situation of like a confrontation like that, one of the best things you can do is actually to say, rather than escalate the situation by continuing the conversation, is actually to say, to recognize that it is a confrontation. And particularly if you're the sort of person that might be more likely to sort of go into, erupt,
React, yeah.
you probably and react, you're probably much better to actually say, I need to step away from this conversation and calm down, and I'm going to come back to it when I feel calmer and more able to finish this conversation at another time. And that way you can then come back to it when you're feeling calmer, and hopefully the other person's feeling calmer as well. Because if they're really agitated and if they're in like that fight or flight and they're sort of, their voice is raised and it's not going to be a productive conversation anyway. It's going to be something that you might both say, or either of you say things that you regret. And so the best thing is to step away and then calm yourself down, and doing things like deep breathing or even walking, even being outside. When we go outside and we use our peripheral vision, it actually changes. It can change from a neuroscience point of view. It can actually change how you feel just by actually looking more widely. It helps regulate your nervous system. And for example, like if you ever notice when you look at like a landscape picture of like a sunset or something beautiful, like a really wide picture, it's because you're using your peripheral vision. And so that from a neuroscience point of view, that actually helps regulate your nervous system. So that's why sometimes if you're in that situation of someone's coming to confront you and have this big discussion and you don't want to have it at that minute, you can say, look, I just want to step outside and I need to take a moment just to calm myself down. Go outside, look around your environment, take some deep breaths, and then step back into the conversation and say, okay, I feel calmer now and I'm willing to continue.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense, and I do notice it with myself. Like for me, I'm somebody that I can deep breathe in the moment, and it doesn't have to be. Someone doesn't have to approach you yelling and screaming. They can be calm as well. They can be mature about it, and someone saying, "Hey, this behavior affected me. This behavior hurt me when you did this and this. It made me feel like this," and you're questioning them. And it could even be like nowadays, people are confronted in a text message. So you even have the time to think and be in your own space, but people are still reacting badly. People are still unable, like their nervous system is still confronted and it's still
You can be
debilitating to
triggered
them.
by a negative text message.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the other thing to think about. And that's where sort of boundaries come in as well. Because just because someone sends you a negative text or something, you don't need to respond straight away. Often we can be thinking, oh, I better respond, but you're actually better to go, you know what? I want to just have a think about what I want to say. I want to just take a moment and step back and actually think about how I'm going to handle this situation, and using messages that talk about, rather than saying you did this and you did that, using the word I, saying like, I feel upset because of what happened, or I feel, so really just trying to, tell the situation from your point of view. Using those I messages can be very powerful. It's a powerful way to diffuse a situation as well. You're saying, I understand what you're saying, but I really feel from my point of view, this or that. And it's sort of hard to argue with someone when they're just telling you, from how they feel from their point of view. They're not accusing you of anything, but they're just telling you from their point of view how they feel. And so that can be a really powerful tool as well. So think about using iMessages. It's a really good psychological trick to remember in relationships.
And the other thing I was curious about too, like, instead of texting as well, like people, a lot of people
Mm,
can't handle a face-to-face confrontation. They're going to react badly. They've had a pattern of reacting badly. And so I
mm.
find text messages, you can't really read tone of voice. You can't, like, someone could say something in such a nice way. So a voice message, sending a voice message, I think, in my
Yeah.
opinion, gives people time. And even if you tell, like, recently, like, I sent a voice message, I confronted somebody, and I told them in the voice message, please take the time to think about this. Please do not respond.
Mm.
Take the time to think, in a week, 2 weeks, just take the time to really think about it. Please don't respond. Unfortunately, they responded and they were very
But you're
good.
right. I mean, texting is actually probably the least um, efficient and effective form of communication because there's no nuance to it. You don't know whether it's said in anger or with a flat tone. So texting, it's very passive. It's not great. It's really not a great way to communicate. It's much better to pick up the phone and just have that conversation. If you can do it in a way that you're going to remain calm and then the other person will remain calm as well, rather than texting, because there's just so much that can be left open to interpretation with texting. And a voice message is a nice idea, at least with a voice message. And I got a really nice voice message from someone the other day. We were messaging back and forth on Instagram, and then she just sent me a voice message, and it was really nice to hear her voice, actually. Just that personal touch. And so, yeah, it can be a really nice thing to do, and actually it's a much better way of communicating than sending a text.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think it makes a significant difference in how the dynamic of the conversation could go, or one way or the other.
Yeah, and emails are not great either. Like email, even though we all spend our life emailing, it's a really ineffective way to communicate. And you're much better to pick up the phone, actually just have a conversation with somebody back and forth, rather than emailing, which can be open to interpretation. There's no nuance. You might not put the full context. So I mean, I do try to pick up the phone and talk to people as much as I can rather than putting it in an email. But sometimes you just get sucked back into bad habits of emailing all the time. But it's quite mentally draining to have to deal with so many emails, and it's
Mm,
not a great way to communicate. It's
no.
really not.
Yeah, no, totally. And the other thing too, so if you're calm and you're trying to confront somebody and you can see that they're not calm, you can see that it's
Mm,
affected them, either it's face to face, or that they have a pattern or a history of not dealing well with confrontation, but it's still important.
mm,
You need to say things. You shouldn't bottle things up anyway. And this person may be defensive and throw it back at you, or they may gaslight you. Would you recommend
mm.
then not to engage in the conversation?
Look, it depends whether it really depends on the situation and whether you think there's a reasonable chance that you can have a meaningful conversation with that person. If it's someone who is very defensive or very aggressive, it's going to be quite difficult then to open lines of communication. And you could just maybe wrong foot them and you could just say to them, how can I support you at the moment to have this conversation that we need to have?
Mm,
What do you need from me right now so that we can
okay.
have this conversation about this point? A really
Wow,
open, yeah.
that's powerful.
Yeah. And they might be like, oh, well, actually, because often with anger and aggression, the underlying emotion for that is often fear.
Yeah.
Anger and aggression is just the sort of way that they express it, but underlying that is often that they're scared and fearful of something. So sometimes you just call them out and say, how can I support you so that we can have this conversation? They'll be like, oh, well, actually, yeah, what I'm really worried about is X. And I might actually be really open for the first time.
That's
But I think it's something
fantastic.
you just need to sort of, yeah, you need to gauge just how open they would be to something like that. But that can work. I know, particularly, I've got 4 kids, and I know sometimes just if they would get, have that sort of angry reaction, sometimes just sitting down with them and saying, what do you really need at the moment? How can I support you? There's obviously stuff going on with you. What do you need? And what do you need from me in terms of support to get you through this, the way you're feeling at the moment? And they'd be like, oh, okay, I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting
Yeah,
to have a big argument.
that's so
And then
good.
often that can be, yeah, often that can be, they'll actually open up and tell you what's really going on with them.
That's
And it's
amazing. That's amazing. So you just told your son, you're like, oh, what do you need from me to have this conversation? And how was his reaction to you?
yeah, well, I think it just really it sort of wrong-footed him in some ways because he was expecting it to be a confrontation, but then he was like, "Oh yeah, well actually this is what I'm worried about." And so I think sometimes if you can think about what's actually underlying the person's behavior and like what's behind it, and not in a condescending way, but just have a think about what's driving them to act this way. And yeah, and I mean, it's definitely worked in that parent-child situation because I was able to sort of say, what's really going on, what's behind all this this behavior. And then he was able to tell me it was more about, what was going on with his peer group, and it was nothing really to do with me and what he was actually angry about. It was all this other stuff that was actually driving his feeling agitated and angry. So yeah, sometimes if you can sort of step back and engage with someone and say, what can I do to support you and what can I do to help you, then they're not really expecting that. And then they'll be like, oh, okay, well, actually, this is what is going on with me.
That's fantastic. So like, I never thought of doing that in the confrontation. Like you're confronting someone, so obviously like something's hurt you. So it takes a lot of maturity to be able to say, "Hey, look, I want to have this conversation with you. So what do you need from me that now to have for us to be able to have this mature conversation?"
Yeah.
That's like never thought of that. So that's fantastic. Take a lot of take a lot of people like a great deal of maturity and self awareness to be able to do that for someone and remove
Yeah,
their
I think
pride.
if it's something that you're really someone that you really care about and you really want to repair that relationship, you can say that then it's worthwhile. It's worthwhile. You're almost sort of putting your ego to one side and just saying that you really want to work on the relationship. And it can be hard to do that because often we lead with our ego. It's our first reaction sometimes. But if you really care about someone, sometimes it can be, and look, this is to make, obviously if it's not a situation where you're being it's detrimental to you, but it's someone that you care about and who cares about you and that you want to, have a good relationship with them. It'd be worthwhile just sort of putting the ego to one side and trying to repair the relationship and say, what what can I do to support this conversation?
That's fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Sophie. I really love this
Hey,
conversation with you. I love meeting you and connecting with you. I love to ask all my guest speakers at the end of every podcast. I'm like, how is the conversation with me right now? I know, just talking out loud about things. Like, how has it made you reflect and highlight anything to you?
look, it's been amazing. I love talking about psychology and mental health. I think we all actually have a lot more innate knowledge within us than we recognize. Sometimes we look elsewhere for the answers, but often if you just take a moment and look inward, you will probably find the answers that you're looking for. And that's what happens when we have conversations like this, that you can actually uncover things that you didn't really realize. And that's why I like talking to different people on different podcasts, because you just never know where the conversation's going to go.
No, you
And so
don't.
it's been great chatting with you. I've really enjoyed it. It's been really, really fun.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Get to Know You. If you enjoyed this podcast, rate, review, and share the podcast on Facebook or Instagram. You can tag me at Get to Know You with Tiffany Farag. In my mission to open conversations and access deeper dialogue, I want to hear from you listeners. The question again, how do you calm your nervous system when confronted? Leave an audio, video, or a message on the Facebook or Instagram page of your response to today's question, including your name and where you are from. We'll include some different responses in next week's Get to Know You Cafe to further deepen dialogue on this topic. If you have any topics you would like us to discuss, be sure to tag me in a post with your question. Join us every Tuesday on Get to Know You. Thank you so much, Sophie. This was really
That's
amazing.
great.
Thank you so
I
much.
can't wait to listen to it back. Well done. It was great. I really enjoyed it.